Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Logistics Executive TV in the turbulent times of tariffs. And today we are talking tariffs and trade relations and impacts and challenges around the world at the moment. This week or the next 2 weeks, we're talking to various folks around the world, subject matter experts across the freight industry, about the latest tariffs from the US administration. Today, I'm joined by Tom Jensen. Tom is the General Manager of the Freight Policy and Operations at Freight and Trade Alliance, our folks, good friends in Australia, FTA, Freight and Trade Alliance. Hey, Tom, thanks for joining us. Where are you today?
Hi, Kim. Thanks for having me. I'm based in Brisbane, so nice and sunny today, so good start of the week.
Brilliant, Bris Vegas. And Tom, you've been in the industry for a couple of years now, roughly 3 or 4 decades. We're working with some of the larger freight organisations around the world, including Hellman, I think, Seva, and a number of others. And of course, you're in a key role with the FTA in Australia. Guys do a fantastic job in advocacy and engagement with the industry and working with government and private and public sector. So, Tom, tariffs. Things have been rolling now from the Trump administration for about 3-4 weeks. This is a rolling story. So if people can see up here the date that this was recorded. So let's have a bit of a chat about what you think is happening in terms of impacts. I know you deal extensively with sea trade, but also air trade, ocean and air in Australia. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the early stages here of impacts for Australia and ramifications.
Yeah, well, as everyone would know, for Australia, we've been hit with a 10% tariff by the US. So any exports going to the US have been hit with that 10% tariff effectively as of last month. And basically, that's continued on. Despite Trump putting in a 90-day pause, he only put a pause in on the tariffs that were above 10% and reduced those down to 10% for 90 days. What the 90 days is going to do is effectively likely do what happened early last year when Biden announced some tariff changes, where he gave them time to deal with that. So with the 90-day pause, it means that some shippers will start front loading if they can, if they've got time within that 90 days to get the goods over to the States before those tariffs increase once again. So what that'll likely do is draw shipping lines' attention to that particular trade lane, and they'll see that demand will increase in that trade lane, and they'll try to get their vessels in there. So what that could mean for the Australian market is that shipping lines might take their attention away from the Australian market, and if they're short on vessels, then that might pull vessels out of the Australian market, impacting our chance of supply into our market. So that would drive rates up as well. So we are already seeing a bit of a rate uptick. So the last 2 weeks, there's been a number of shipping lines announcing rate restorations, and they've seemed to push some of those through. And those last 2 weeks, we've seen a 4.5% increase globally in sea freight rates. Well, prior to that, year to date, we'd seen 45% decline in rates. So the demand hasn't been there, but this is obviously disrupting the market and causing shipping lines to be able to make that demand, that wane in demand, surplus to need, and basically they're supplying higher rates to suit the trend in the market at the moment.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And, of course, yes, for the folks around the world who are being hit with much, much higher tariffs, I suppose to some degree there must be some element of loyalty or alignment between the Australian government and the US government if it's only 10%. And of course, this is blanket. Yeah, this is not selective. There's no sort of selective nature about the tariffs. We've seen in the last few days the rolling back of a lot of the tariffs from against China for technology, smartphones, computers, various other elements of the technology market. Are there any variations in Australia, or it's just blanket?
It's still the same. We've got the blanket ban so far, but basically what you just mentioned in terms of the smartphones being let off the hook, and that we're probably going to see a bit more of that. There was a survey done just recently by one of the media outlets in the States, and out of 120 companies they surveyed, 89% confirmed they've cancelled orders out of China. So Out of that, 75% were expecting consumer spend to decline, and most won't be reshoring to the US. They're talking about it's not going to draw them to manufacturing in the US. They're going to look at opportunities still outside the US at the lesser tariffed countries. So, and even if they do look at manufacturing in the US again, most of them express that they'd likely automate rather than increase jobs for people. So it's having effects widespread. The effect to Australia, like you say, is still only 10%. I know the government's been essentially reverse marketing that and suggesting that they've negotiated it to the 10% being the lowest bracket, but now they obviously didn't get a reduction from that 10% while everyone else seemed to get a bit of a reduction that wasn't on that minimum. So I don't think our ties with the US are too strong on this topic, but it remains to be seen.
So I've been resident, as you know, of Australia as well as various other places, including here in the UAE over the last 30 years. Of course, when I was full-time living in Australia, there was, up until about 10 years ago, or even less, there was quite a trade war between Australia and China. Nothing to do with the US, at which point they had put massive tariffs on Australian wine, which is one of the big exports, and seafood, crayfish, shellfish, and what have you, which are huge previous supply to China, and then they just cut them off. What was the background to that? Can you recall?
I think that was just tensions in terms of governments themselves. I think since that was a lot to do with the Scott Morrison government at the time. So they didn't seem to like that government too much, and they implemented those tariffs. And then like we are today with America to some degree, Albanese can't get a foot in the door with the president at the moment. But that was the same with China at that time. But at least this time around, we are dealing with the government behind the scenes. With the relative ministers for their portfolios, but in terms of back then, the Australian government couldn't get a foot in the door even at that level. So right now, at least we do have dialogue, but it remains to be seen where that goes. I don't think Trump's willing to offer anyone a bit of a dispensation at this point in time, but like I was about to say with the smartphones that you mentioned earlier, where they've now lifted the tariffs on those, there is whispers as a result of some of those surveys and feedbacks from America's top CEOs that the backlash is causing Trump to possibly reconsider lifting a few other commodities along the way. So who knows where we'll be tomorrow.
Well, hopefully we'll get back to, well, certainly we'll have another chat in a couple of months to update. And I'm sure things for Australia will be slightly different. I bundled sort of New Zealand into Australia as well because the APAC, the ANZ market is very similar. You mentioned just before about the potential of a limitation or a diminishment of capacity of ocean cargo coming in and out of Australia. Is that going to be a concern for our exporters for big markets in the rest of the world, for meat and grain and steel in particular?
Yeah, anyone that's in the bulk carriers less so, but all the containerized carriers, yes, definitely. So we're seeing a lot more blank sailings creep in. So blank sailings in the last month or so, they've increased from about 8% globally up to around 12% as of last Friday. That's forecast to continue increasing. So the carriers are obviously trying to make sure that they can drive up rates through that method as much as they can. We're also hearing booking cancellations out of China are impacting, so might mean less sailings out of China into Australia eventually, and that obviously would mean less sailings out again. So there's going to be some flow-on effects as well. So, and price-wise, as I mentioned, the rates are expected to increase for the foreseeable future now, despite demand being relatively low prior to this tariff issue becoming an issue.
Cool. Now, of course, FTA, just for a wrap, is of course the major advocacy and representation group for what must be thousands of exporters and importers in Australia and the freight, both on ocean and air platforms in Australia. What advisory? It's early days, and we will be talking again But at this stage, what advisory you giving, is FTA giving to its members about how to deal with the impacts so far? Have you been able to formulate any policies yet in terms of advisory and messages to your customers and to your members?
Yeah, it's hard to predict at the moment. It's still a bit of early days at this point in time. But one thing we are proactively engaging is government in terms of support. So Austrade obviously announced immediately once the tariffs were implemented, the government did a good job in getting Austrade to provide support to exporters and producers through monetary support and so on. But we're also, and the Australian Financial Review picked up on this just early this week, but essentially the structural flaws in the system in terms of additional charges, we're highlighting that to the government as well, where whilst we're suffering on the international freight front, it's time that they looked at some of the domestic issues like the incontestable landside charges with terminal access charges, empty container park notification fees and so on. So at the moment, they're continuing to go unregulated and they've got a voluntary code in place for the terminal charges, but we're basically trying to get the government to reopen the books on that and look at the Productivity Commission review findings and take advice from the ACCC that the structural flaws are there, and a quick win for government might be to help address those issues, because that's costing industry up to $2 billion a year.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose just anybody in our world, which is a big part of the world that you and I live in the freight and trade industry, is operating. A lot of freight operators are operating on much lower margins than 10%. So a 10% tariff has certainly got to have a roll and rock-on effect, not only consumers, which maybe we'll talk about next time, but in terms of the operators themselves that you represent and provide advisory to. This is a serious issue no matter what, whether it's 10%, 5% or 50%. So look, let's see how things pan out. I really appreciate your contribution and your insights there, Tom. And we look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Tom Jensen, General Manager, Freight and Policy and Operations at the Freight and Trade Alliance in Australia, the FTA. And we look forward to catching up with them again soon. All the best and down under, Tom.
Thank you.